I spent my entire life believing in progress. I dedicated myself to studying economics, traveling the world, speaking at conferences, reassuring people that humanity was moving in the right direction. Every crisis, every shift in power, every new policy, it was all part of the inevitable evolution of society. I trusted the system. I trusted the plan. That was until the day I died. It was supposed to be a normal lecture, another routine discussion about global finance and the upcoming changes in economic structures. The audience listened attentively as I spoke about the future, about innovation, about the Agenda 2030 and how it was designed to create balance and sustainability. I was in control, confident, until I felt it. A sharp, burning pain surged through my head, sudden and unforgiving. My vision blurred, the faces in the audience distorting, their expressions morphing into something unreadable. My body betrayed me. My legs gave out, my breath caught in my throat, and before I could understand what was happening, I collapsed. The world around me faded. The noise, the murmurs, the rushed footsteps, all of it dissolved into silence. Then, there was nothing. But I was still aware. At first I thought I was dreaming. There was no tunnel, no bright light, no voices of lost loved ones welcoming me to the afterlife. Instead, I stood in a vast, endless space. White, infinite, without walls, without a floor, without a ceiling. A void that wasn't empty but felt like it contained everything at once. I wasn't afraid. I should have been, but there was a stillness in the air, something that made me feel as though I was standing on the edge of something enormous. Then, in front of me, a book appeared. It floated in midair, enormous, ancient, its pages glowing faintly with a golden hue. Slowly it began to open, its pages flipping on their own, revealing scenes. Not of myths, not of distant legends, but of history itself. I saw the rise and fall of empires, wars that reshaped the world, leaders who promised change and delivered control. I saw crises that had been carefully crafted, systems designed not to free people but to bind them. I saw events I had studied my entire life, but from a perspective I had never considered before. Everything followed a pattern. Every collapse had led to more power in the hands of fewer people. Every solution had come at the cost of freedom. Every advancement had required a sacrifice that no one had questioned. And then, the pages stopped turning. The book froze on an image I had not yet seen, an era that had not yet arrived. But I recognized it immediately. It was the world in 2030. Something inside me shifted. My entire life had been spent advocating for this great transformation, this economic restructuring, this global unity. But as I stared at the vision in front of me, I felt something I had never felt before. Doubt. Then, a voice called my name. A voice unlike anything I had ever heard. I turned and my breath caught in my throat. Someone was standing there waiting for me, watching me. And in that moment, I knew. I was about to learn the truth. The presence before me was overwhelming. It was not just the sight of him, but the weight of his being, the absolute certainty that I was standing before something beyond human comprehension. My body, if I even had a body in this place, felt weightless, yet I was rooted in place, unable to move, unable to speak. His eyes met mine and I felt every part of me exposed, as if he could see not just my life but every thought, every moment of doubt, every belief I had clung to so desperately. Without a word, he lifted his hand and touched my forehead. A rush of energy surged through me and the white void around us shifted. The book that had floated in front of me vanished and suddenly, I was somewhere else. I stood in the middle of a city, but it wasn't the world I knew. The buildings were sleek, towering structures made of glass and steel, reflecting the bright digital screens that covered them. There were no billboards, no advertisements, only symbols, numbers, and instructions. The streets were silent, though people moved through them in perfect harmony, their faces neutral, their pace measured. There was no urgency, no traffic, no voices raised in debate or discussion. Everything was controlled. A sound echoed through the air, a voice not from a human, but from everywhere at once. A system-generated announcement, emotionless and absolute. Welcome to the new era. Security, stability, equality. No more hunger, no more ownership, no more uncertainty. The world is now one. I felt my stomach tighten. There were no stores, no homes that belonged to anyone. Every building looked the same. Every person wore the same type of clothing. There was no sign of individuality, no sense of freedom. I turned and suddenly I was inside a vast facility. The walls were lined with screens, each displaying rows of faces, names, and digital markers. People scanned their wrists at stations, exchanging digital credits for access to food, transportation, and shelter. You own nothing, and you are happy. The phrase was everywhere, on the walls, in the air, embedded in the very foundation of this world. I tried to speak, to ask where I was, but before the words could leave my lips, everything shifted again. Now I was in a conference room. A group of men and women sat around a massive table, their faces calm, composed. They weren't politicians. They weren't the leaders I had expected. They were CEOs, technocrats, the true architects of the new world. A man at the head of the table spoke, his voice even and unwavering. The transition is nearly complete. By 2030, the old system will be fully obsolete. They will not resist what they do not understand. They will embrace it as progress. Another figure nodded. Faith must be reshaped. The idea of absolute truth is the last barrier. We must redefine it. I felt a cold dread settle in my chest. Everything I had, once believed to be separate, governments, corporations, ideologies, had merged into one entity. The world had not been conquered by force. It had been surrendered willingly. The vision blurred again, and I found myself standing before one final image. A grand stage. A man standing before the world, delivering a message of hope, of unity, of a new beginning. And then I saw his face. Someone I never expected, someone the world wasn't ready for. Before I could process what I was seeing, everything collapsed into darkness. And I was falling again. I was no longer falling. The darkness around me didn't feel empty, but heavy, as if it carried the weight of every decision ever made, every path chosen or abandoned. Then without warning, the void cracked open and I was standing once more. The air was thick, charged with an energy I couldn't describe. Before me stood Jesus. His presence alone silenced every question, every doubt. He was not just standing there. He was there in a way that reality itself seemed to revolve around him. His gaze held no anger, no disappointment, only understanding, as if he had been waiting for this moment long before I had even existed. I wanted to speak, to ask what was happening. But before I could form the words, he raised his hand. Suddenly, the world around us shifted and I saw. I was no longer in the void, I was in the future. The year was 2030, but it wasn't the world I remembered. Everything was efficient, structured, controlled. People moved through the streets with purpose but without passion. There was no hunger, no visible suffering, no chaos. But there was something missing. I turned to Jesus, my voice trembling. This looks like peace. He looked at me with a sorrow I couldn't comprehend. Peace is not the absence of suffering. Peace is the presence of truth. And then I realized it. There were no churches, no places of worship, no symbols of faith. Religion had not been banned, it had been redefined. A massive screen flickered to life and a man appeared, speaking words that sounded righteous, hopeful, unifying. But they were empty, devoid of any real meaning. There is no need to seek the divine beyond what we create. We are one. We are enough. The crowd below nodded, accepting, believing. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't that they had been forced to believe this. They had chosen to. I looked back at Jesus, my mind racing. Where is the church? Where are those who still believe? His face remained calm, but the sorrow in his eyes deepened. Some remain, but they are few. The world has been taught that to follow me is to divide, to resist progress. The streets blurred again, and I found myself inside a massive hall, where leaders from different nations and industries gathered around a sleek white table. They weren't debating policies. They weren't arguing over differences. They were finalizing something. A woman at the table tapped a screen in front of her. The transition to a single economic system is complete. Currency is obsolete. All transactions are monitored. It ensures total security. A man beside her nodded. The ownership model is officially dismantled. No individual owns property. Everything is provided. Another voice, calm and calculated, spoke next. Faith has been integrated. The old ways have been phased out. Humanity now follows a single path. My heart pounded. I had spent years defending this very plan, calling it progress. But standing here, watching it unfold, I understood the cost. It hadn't been forced upon them. They had welcomed it. Jesus placed a hand on my shoulder, and I turned to him, my voice barely a whisper. Why did they accept this? His response was simple. Because they were told it would save them. I shook my head, my mind rejecting the truth my soul already knew. But isn't this what humanity wanted? No war, no poverty, no inequality. Jesus looked into the distance as if seeing beyond the walls of time itself. They traded freedom for comfort, truth for control. They were convinced that surrender was the path to unity. The vision around me began to dissolve, but before it did, I caught one final glimpse, a new figure rising to prominence, someone younger, unexpected, but with a name the world already knew. And then, everything collapsed. I gasped, and in an instant, I was back in the void, standing alone, before Jesus. My mind was still racing, trying to hold on to the images, the warnings. I took a shaky breath. This is going to happen, isn't it? Jesus studied me for a long moment before answering. It has already begun. Silence fell between us, heavy and unbreakable. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. What can I do? Jesus' gaze didn't waver. You cannot wake those who refuse to see. But those who are already questioning will listen. Something inside me shifted. The weight of my old beliefs crumbled. I had spent my life convinced that this future was inevitable, that it was good, that it was right. But now I knew the truth. I had a choice. And before I could say another word, before I could even process what that truly meant, everything went dark again. And I woke up. I gasped, my chest heaving, my body jerking violently, as if I had been yanked from another reality. The first thing I felt was pain, a dull, throbbing ache spreading through my head, my limbs, my chest. The second was confusion. I was alive, but the world around me felt wrong, unfamiliar, as if I had returned to something less real than where I had just been. Blinding fluorescent lights flickered above me. The beeping of machines filled the air, and a distant voice called out, muffled and distorted. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like I was dragging myself out of something deeper than sleep. Then suddenly faces appeared, doctors, nurses, expressions of shock and disbelief. He's awake, someone muttered, as if they hadn't expected me to be. I blinked, trying to focus, my throat dry and raw. Where? My voice cracked, barely a whisper. You're in the hospital, a nurse said gently, adjusting something near my IV. You collapsed during your lecture. You had a stroke. A stroke. The words didn't seem to fit, didn't match the enormity of what I had just experienced. I hadn't simply blacked out. I had died. I had seen the future. I had spoken to him. Memories flooded back. The book, the vision of 2030, the system that had quietly enslaved humanity, the last words Jesus had spoken to me. It has already begun. Panic surged through me. I needed to tell someone, I needed to warn them. I need to speak, I croaked, trying to sit up, but the nurse gently pressed me back down. You need to rest, she insisted. No, you Don't understand, I gasped. I stopped myself. How could I even begin to explain? If I said I had died and spoken to Jesus, that I had seen a vision of the future where the world surrendered its freedom without even realizing it, would they believe me? Would I have believed me? The doctor approached, checking my vitals, his expression unreadable. Your test results are strange, he admitted. Your brain scans show signs of trauma, but there's no permanent damage. By all accounts, you shouldn't have woken up this quickly. I barely heard him. My mind was racing. The system was already in motion. The changes had already begun. And most people, just like I had been, were blind to it. They didn't even realize they were walking willingly into their own submission. I turned to the nurse. What year is it? She hesitated. It's still 2024. I exhaled shakily. There was time. Not much, but time. Do you remember anything? She asked. Before you collapsed? I hesitated. I couldn't tell them everything. Not yet. Not until I understood what I was supposed to do with this knowledge. But Jesus' words echoed in my mind. You cannot wake those who refuse to see, but those who are already questioning will listen. I remember enough, I finally said. The doctor gave me a strange look but didn't press further. Your body needs to recover, but cognitively you seem fine. More than fine, actually. It's like your mind was never affected at all. I nodded, barely listening. Because I had just realized something. I had spent my entire life dismissing those who questioned the system, calling them paranoid, conspiracy theorists, fearmongers. Now I had become one of them, and I had a choice to make. Either I stayed silent, pretended none of this had happened, went back to my comfortable life and ignored the warning I had been given, or I started speaking, started questioning, started waking up those who were already beginning to sense that something was wrong. I had seen the future, and I couldn't unsee it. The hospital room felt smaller now, suffocating, like the walls were pressing in. The steady beeping of the monitors, the soft murmur of nurses outside my door. Everything felt distant, irrelevant, compared to the storm raging inside my mind. I had been given a glimpse of the future, and now I was back in a world that had no idea what was coming. I had a choice. I could pretend none of it had happened, convince myself it was just a hallucination from the stroke, a trick of the brain, under stress. But deep down I knew the truth. It was real. Every second of it. The moment the doctors cleared me, I left the hospital, stepping back into a world that felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because I had. The streets were the same, people walked by, glued to their phones, lost in their own worlds, oblivious. But now I could see the patterns, the slow, careful restructuring of society, the subtle conditioning that had already begun. I went home and locked myself in my study. I had to know. I had spent my entire life defending the system, ridiculing those who spoke of hidden agendas. But what if they had been right? What if the very thing I had dismissed as paranoia was already unfolding before my eyes? I pulled up my old research, but this time I read it differently. I connected the dots. The push for a cashless society, marketed as convenience, but in reality, it meant total financial surveillance. The disappearance of personal ownership, sold as a way to free people from responsibility, but in truth it left them powerless. The redefinition of faith, not an outright ban, but a slow erosion, a transformation into something inoffensive, universal, controlled. The headlines flashed before me, each one confirming what I had seen in my vision. The world wasn't being taken over by force. It was surrendering willingly. I started writing, not to convince anyone, but to document everything while I still could. Every connection I made, every policy change that lined up with the vision Jesus had shown me. I didn't know if anyone would listen, but I had to try. The first time I posted about it, I expected backlash, and I got it. You sound insane. This is fear-mongering. You used to be respected. What happened to you? But then came the other messages. I've been feeling like something is wrong, but I couldn't put it into words. Your post explained everything. I thought I was alone. I thought I was crazy, but I see it too. Tell me more. They weren't the majority, but they were enough. I realized then what Jesus meant. I wasn't here to wake up the world. That wasn't possible. I was here for the ones who were already questioning. I started connecting with others. People who had seen the same patterns, who had noticed the slow restructuring but had been too afraid to speak. Some had even had their own visions, not identical to mine, but pointing to the same inevitable conclusion. The more I shared, the more I learned. The year 2030 wasn't an accident, it was a goal. Everything that was happening, economic shifts, technological advancements, global policies, was being carefully aligned for that specific moment in time. I wasn't a prophet. I wasn't chosen. I was just a man who had been allowed to see behind the curtain. And now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge, because the clock was ticking, and 2030 was getting closer. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. Everything I had seen wasn't just a possibility, it was already unfolding. Every policy, every new system being introduced, every shift in global narratives was leading toward one single point in time, 2030. I no longer tried to convince people who didn't want to listen. That wasn't my mission. I focused on those who already felt something was wrong but couldn't explain why. The world was changing, not in an instant, not through war or force, but through quiet submission. People weren't resisting because they didn't see the chains being placed around them. They believed they were being saved. And that was the plan all along. One night, as I stared at the endless stream of news reports, economic forecasts, and global agreements, I thought back to the moment I stood before Jesus. The weight of his words settled over me once again. You cannot wake those who refuse to see, but those who are already questioning will listen. I understood now. This wasn't about fighting the system. It was about helping people see before it was too late. Not by force, not through fear, but by asking the right questions. If you've made it this far, then maybe you've started asking them too. Maybe you've noticed the changes, the way the world is shifting, the way control is being disguised as progress. Maybe you've felt that unease in your gut, the quiet voice telling you that something isn't right. If so, you're not alone. The choice has never been clearer. You can ignore this, dismiss it, convince yourself that the future being built is one of freedom, not control, that what is coming is for your own good. Or you can start paying attention. Look beyond the headlines, read between the lines. Follow the patterns, the policies, the decisions that aren't up for debate but are being made for you. Because one day, sooner than you think, you'll wake up in 2030. And when you do, will you recognize the world around you? Or will it be too late?